Okay. Good evening, everybody. Welcome. It's nice to see you all. I hope everyone is doing well. I hope I had a chance to say hello to everyone individually. Rabbi Gerson, nice to see you again. Welcome. Shalom Aleichem. And I think that's a virtual background that you have there, but I hope it's not. It's such a beautiful library.
Yeah, you don't want to see the real mess behind me.
Wow. Okay.
It's
Another one of
books,
the
but not as neatly organized.
another one of the benefits of Zoom. Okay. So nice to have everyone. Welcome. Today is Tuesday, December 5th. Normally we meet on Wednesday, but I have a conflict tomorrow, so we're meeting today. Thank you all for making the adjustment. And this is the second of our two-part series on issues related to the Gaza war. And today we're going to be discussing redeeming captives. But as we did last week, we're going to spend some time on a tshuva, on a responsa from a contemporary rabbi dealing with this issue. But before we get there, we have to look at some of the classic sources in our Torah let's say bank of sources that deal with redeeming captives. And then we're going to have to answer the key question, which is, do any of these sources have anything to tell us or teach us about how to cope with the terrible situation that we're dealing with now? Now, of course, I do not think the Israeli government or army has a shiur in Pidyon Shvuyim before they begin their negotiations with Hamas or with whoever else they're talking to. But we'll see that some of these sources actually tapped into some of some real feelings and issues that many of us have been thinking about and dealing with since the situation has begun. So let's jump right in, and we're going to start with a number of sources that show just examples of hostage situations or people taken captive in a war that we see in the Torah. And we'll see that this issue is as old as time itself, or at least as old as the Bible itself. For example, just a few weeks ago in Sefer Bereshit, we read about Lot, who was kidnapped, and what Avraham did in order to save him. Vayishma Avram ki nishba achiv, vayarek et chanichav yilidei veto shmona asar ushalosh mayot vayirdof adan. Avram heard that his kinsmen, meaning Lot and others, were taken captive, and he gathered his soldiers, 318, and went to pursue them. Right? He just saddled up, and he went to pursue to get back Lot. And the last pasuk, Vayashev et kol harechush v'gam et Lot achiv. He managed to get back all of the possessions that were taken, and Lot as well, Urechusho, and all of Lot's belongings. Heshiv v'gam et hanashim v'yata'am, and the women and the rest of the people. So this was a situation not unlike the one that we're dealing with, where many people were taken captive. And you see that right away, Avraham, without hesitation, musters an army and goes and redeems or recaptures or frees somehow Lot. There's another example that I wanted to show you here in Bamidbar. This is really interesting, dealing with the Canaanite king, Vayishma Kanani Melech Arad, Yoshev HaNegev, Kiva Yisrael Derech HaAtarim, Vayilachem BeYisrael, Vayish Mimenu Shevi. So the Canaanites, they go to war with Bnei Yisrael, and they take some of Bnei Yisrael captive. And then listen to what Bnei Yisrael does. Vayidor Yisrael neder Lashem vayomar im noton titain et ha'am hazeh biyadi V'charamti et areim. If you deliver them into me, presumably so we can get the captives back, I'm going to dedicate all the spoils. We're not going to keep any of the spoils. Vayishma Hashem b'kol Yisrael vayiten haKanani vayacharem etem v'tareihem vayikra Hashem makom charma. What's really interesting here is that Rashi says in this next source, Eina ela shifcha achat. It was only one maidservant who was taken captive. And nonetheless, just with one, right, the angst and the fear and the sense of, the world falling apart when someone is taken captive is so strong that in this case, one captive, and I'll say a captive who was, let's say, on the margins of society, a shifcha, and a maidservant on the margins of society, nonetheless, Bnei Yisrael were so perturbed by this reality that they made this promise to God so that they could get this single captive back. I want to show you two other biblical sources. This is a source from Shmuel Aleph, Samuel 1, that David, while he's running for his life, goes to a town called Siklag. And he holds up in Siklag. But while he's there, the Amalekites attacked Siklag and they take a number of people captive. If you look at Pasuk Bet, Vayishvu et hanashim asher ba mikaton ve'ad gadol, lo hemitu ish vayinhagu vayelchu darkam. They didn't kill anyone, but they did take women and girls captive. And Vayavo David va'anashav el ha'ir. David gets back there. He was away when this happened, and David returns. Just listen to this. Vayavo David va'anashav el ha'ir v'hinei serufa ba'esh u'nishtehem u'v'neihem u'v'notehem nishbu. David gets back. The town has been burned down. Right, just echoes of what we saw on October 7th. The town was burned down, and wives and sons and daughters were taken captive. And what is David's reaction and the reaction of his men? Vayisa David va'am asher ito et kolam vayivchu ad asher ein bahem koach livkot. They cried until they could cry no more. And like they ran out of tears. This was so horrible. The thought of this is so horrible that they cried. And then, after they cried, what does David do? Vayishal David b'Hashem lemor, verse 8, David inquired of God, Erdof acharei hagedud hazeh ha'asigenu, vayomer lo redof ki haseg tasig v'hatzel tatzil. David seeks expert advice, in this case from the expert of experts, from God, to see whether or not he can have a successful military campaign to go get the captives back. So this is a fascinating source. It is so close to what happened in Israel. The town is burned. Men, women, and children are taken captive. The first reaction, right, is to cry. It's just awful. And then only after they cry and emptied their eyes from tears, then they go and they seek out expert advice to decide whether or not they should mount a military campaign to get the captives back. So you have three sources, all of them on some level echoing, right? I see these sources in such a different way now than I did before October 7th. They echo so much of what we have been feeling about the situation in Israel, especially this last one about the town being burned, people crying, and then seeking expert advice as to what to do. And finally, one other source from the Tanakh, with the help of a Gemara. Here, Yirmiyahu was telling Bnei Yisrael what is going to happen to them in exile when they are finally defeated. V'hayaki amru elecha ana netzeh. If they ask you, to what shall we go forth? I mean, what's going to happen to us? V'amarta alehem. Ko amar Hashem asher lamavet lamavet, v'asher lacherev lacherev, v'asher larav larav, v'asher lashvi lashevi. Those destined for plague to plague, those destined for the sword to the sword, those destined to famine, and those destined for captivity to captivity. So this is bad enough as it is, but notice that there are four things listed here: plague, I guess death by sword, famine, and captivity. And the Gemara says this: Amar le Rabba bar Mari mina hamilta da'amar rabbanan de pidyon shvuyin mitzvah rabbahi. The previous Gemara, for a little background in Baba Vatra, said that redeeming captives is a mitzvah rabbah, a great mitzvah. And then Gemara says, well, how do we know that it's a great mitzvah? That the Gemara does this. He quotes the pasuk that we just read in Yirmiyahu, and then says at the very last line, Kol ha'meuchar b'pasuk ze kashet mechavero. That this verse is moving in a best to worst scenario direction. The best scenario is plague, and then sword, and then famine. The worst possible thing that could happen is shvi, is captivity. Whichever punishment is written later in the verse is more severe, and that's how the Gemara learns that pidyon shavuyin is a mitzvah rabbah, because if being held captive is worse than plague, sword, and famine, then redeeming people from that captivity is a mitzvah rabbah. So these are a number of examples from Tanakh, the last one culminating in this notion that the worst of all possible things that could happen is captivity. So just want to stop here and see if there are any reflections or thoughts or questions on the sources we have seen so far, before we get into a few more rabbinic sources and then the responsa that we're going to study. And again, the responsa is now going to address this question. It's going to address a larger question about halacha in general. So any comments? Okay, if there are no comments, then let's continue. Or no questions? Let me just see, anyone have their hand up? I'm looking. No? Okay. Okay, so let's continue. I want to look at we've had some biblical examples where we see sort of quick reactions to the reality of captives. Abraham immediately goes to save Lot. David, we see cries and then seeks out expert advice. But now we go from a situation where we have these psukim and these examples in the Tanakh to the rabbis creating real policy for to deal with the situation. Right? What we saw in the examples from Tanakh don't provide a policy as to how to deal with the situation. They give us examples of what happened. But now let's see how the rabbis create policy. Okay, let's see. The Gemara, the Mishnah says, "Ein podin et hashivuyim yoter al kedei demehen." We said that pidyon shivuyim is a mitzvah rabbah, a great mitzvah because of how horrific it is to lose our freedom, to be taken away. But the Gemara Mishnah says, it's true, but we do not redeem for more than their actual monetary value. So let me stop here and ask you a question. What does that mean? What does that actual? What does it mean? Actual value. We do not redeem for more than actual value. How is that value decided?
The only thing that comes to mind is like insurance values, like for a legal case. Someone's
Okay, interesting. Okay, although I'm not sure in the Gemara if they had kidnapping insurance
Or his
Right.
status, in the community.
Okay, status in the community. So it could be, one could be, and it's similar to the insurance question, the insurance answer and the answer of status, in that there is a market. There used to be, there still are these things in certain societies, thankfully not many. There's a price that you can buy people for, right? There was a slave market. And you didn't want to pay the captors more than that value. That's one possibility of what this means. Another possibility could be that there was a redeeming captives sort of market, right? The what the going rate is. Like now, you want to see what the going rate in a house is. You open up Zillow, I think that's what it's called, and you see what a going rate per square foot, right? What a property costs. So back then, there was also an understood rate for captives. Whatever the case may be, you're not allowed to overpay, the Mishnah says, and the Mishnah explains why. Mipnei tikun ha'olam. Because of the betterment of the world. What does that mean? Anyone know what tikkun, what type of betterment of the world is being threatened, or what type of betterment of the world is created when we don't overpay to redeem captives? Anybody want?
I'm wondering if people know that they can make a living off of, kidnapping people and getting paid for it, then it might make it, something that people think, oh, this is a nice industry to go into.
Okay,
For
great.
the world.
Right. Thank you, Stacey Viva. That it could encourage more kidnapping. Right? If I could guarantee an absorbent sum, then it may encourage more kidnapping. Okay, that's an excellent possibility. Carol, did you want to just unmute, Carol?
Am I on now?
Yeah.
Oh, she said pretty much what I was going to say, which was to set a precedent for future kidnappings. And it also brought to mind what we in America have paid captives. What we've been willing to pay, and the Israelis too. How many Palestinians in the prisons in Israel would we be willing to exchange for one captive, for example, one Israeli, one Jewish?
Great, thank you, Carol. So as we now look at these sources, which we're going to try to see as the rabbinic attempt to create a public policy around this issue, let's keep that question in mind. If tikkun olam means that we don't want to create a situation where it will encourage more kidnapping, does the exchange of, let's say, in this case where we are right now, one Israeli hostage for 3 Palestinians, or in the case of Gilad Shalit, one for over 1,000, is that too much? And does that threaten tikkun olam? Is that a similar situation? That's the question we're going to try to answer. So that's something to think about, keep in mind as we go. And so the Gemara says, what is tikkun olam? One answer is mishum duchka ditzibura. The first explanation to go on is it's just simply too expensive and it will bankrupt the community. If every time someone is taken hostage, the community has to pay an exorbitant fee, well, there won't be any money to keep any other communal institution operating. The hospitals, the schools, the mikvahs, the shuls, they have to sell all of the communities have to sell all of its holdings and its belongings and liquidate all of its wealth, and it's just going to destroy the community, right? It'll bring financial ruin to a community. That's one explanation of what could happen if we pay too much. And the second one is, as you already suggested, is that it may cause them to seize additional captives. What's the difference between these two examples? When the Gemara gives two examples, it often does that because one example doesn't cover all the situations. Okay, so Rashi helps us. V'nafka mina, right over here, where it's highlighted. V'nafka mina, im yesh lo av ashir u karov sherotze lifdoto b'damim harbe lo yipiluhu al hatzibor. We were concerned that maybe paying this exorbitant fee will bankrupt the community. But what if the captive has a very rich father? So the father is willing to pay an exorbitant sum, and it's not going to affect the community. It's not going to bankrupt the community. It may still encourage other people to take captives, but it won't necessarily bankrupt the community because there may be an individual who is willing to accept upon themselves the cost of redeeming that one person without needing recourse to the community. So we see here that the rabbis are trying to put some sort of limit on how we look at this in order to safely protect the well-being of the community, as well as to make sure that more captives are not taken, and this does not become, we do not enter into a situation where we have a hostage industry. Now the Gemara goes on to give a number of examples of exceptions to this rule, right? When people were redeemed for more than their worth. And I'm not going to go into all the sources, but I'll tell you the four exceptions. One is when there are competing values, like a husband going to redeem a wife, where on the one hand, we have a value, we don't want to bankrupt, we don't want to create a situation where more people will go into the hostage industry. But on the other hand, we have the husband's obligation to support and take care of his wife. And so maybe that overrules or outweighs other considerations. Another competing value, another exception, would be leadership capacity. The Gemara tells a story about a potential great scholar, a child who the rabbis thought was going to turn into a great scholar, and they rescue this child for an exorbitant fee. And because this child was going to be a great Torah scholar, or we could contemporize it and say, as I heard suggested, if the president of the United States was taken captive, we may be willing to pay an exorbitant fee. 3, let's say the captive's life is in danger. Right? Wouldn't that overrule the other concerns? And 4, a change in circumstances. And that refers to an interesting statement in the Tosfot over here when it's trying to understand why in one case that the Gemara gives, a person was ransomed for way more than the market value. And the Gemara says because during the time of the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, where taking Jews captive was sort of what people did, so even if you paid a lot of money, it wasn't going to create more of a market because there already was a situation where people were just indiscriminately taking Jews captive. Okay, so those are the four examples. Again, where we may pay for more than they're worth. One is husband, like competing values. 2 is leadership capacity of the captive. 3 is the captive's life is in danger. And 4 is we're not really concerned with this question of tikkun olam and the possibility that it's going to increase hostage taking, because hostage taking was already at such a high level that it didn't, that wasn't a factor. So in brief, that is a sort of summary of examples in the Tanakh of hostage taking and the sort of the emotional and quick reactions that we've had to them: war, crying, seeking out guidance. And then the rabbinic attempt to create some sort of public policy around this, where we have a general rule that we don't ransom captives for more than their value, but we also see, and some of them are not necessarily argued on by the rabbis, we also see exceptions to the rule where people, communities, individuals did pay exceeding amounts of money because of the specific situation that called for exception to the general rule of not overpaying. So now let's ask a question, and I'll pose the question, and we'll look at the beginning of this tshuva, of this responsa. So first, I'll introduce the author of the responsa. The author of the responsa is Rabbi Chaim David Halevi. Rabbi Chaim David Halevi is this person in this picture here. I hope you see his picture. Can everyone see his picture? Rabbi Chaim David Halevi was you see his years, 1924 to 1988. And he was the Sephardic chief rabbi of Tel Aviv and Yafo. His teacher was Rabbi Ben Sion Uziel, who was at one point the Sephardi chief rabbi of Israel. And then Rabbi Chaim David Halevi became his assistant, and then he became chief rabbi of Tel Aviv and Yafo in 1973. Okay. He became chief rabbi of Tel Aviv and Yafo, taking over for Avad Yosef, who I think at that point became chief rabbi of Israel. And he wrote a 9-volume, I think it's 9 volumes, a 9-volume set of responsa called Aseh Lecha Rav, these nice color green volumes. And we're going to look at one of his responsa now. And what's interesting about his responsa, that they're very easy to read, very clear language, and so a very enjoyable way to learn responsa. So everyone see this? It says Nun Gimel here. Pidyon Shavuyim Timurat Shichrur Mechablim. So redeeming captives in exchange for freeing terrorists. Rav Halevi here is writing this article / Teshuva in response to another article on the same topic written by Rabbi Shlomo Goren, who at one point was the first chief rabbi of the Israeli army, and then became chief rabbi of Israel. So let's read a bit, and then we'll pose the question, and we'll see what our esteemed group has to say, and then we'll read Rav Chaim David Halevi. So right here, where the cursor is, I hope you could see, I just highlighted the first word. Karati be'inyan rav et ma'amaro shel kavod hagon Rav Shlomo Goren shlita al pidyon shavuyim timurat shechrur mechablim l'fi halacha. Rav Goren wrote an article about this. This article was written in May 1985. Rav Goren's article was written in May 1985. And let me turn this. Okay. So before we do that, let me ask you a question. What, in your estimation, in your view, of what we learned would apply or would not apply, or did anything we learn, like how could you use what we learned to answer this question, right? How would you go about answering the question of redeeming captives for the release of terrorists with the sources that we study? What are some of the factors? It doesn't have to be a fully developed answer. What were some of the factors that you would think are important from what we studied?
Well, I think about future consequences is a big one. So is it going to lead to more captive taking?
So, okay, so if Israel releases 3, 10, 50, 100, 500 terrorists for every Israeli, maybe it's going to encourage the bad guys to take even more hostages, because they'll be able to get even more of their brethren who are in prison back. So that's very much like Mipnei Tikkun Ha'olam that the Mishnah said. Okay, good. Anyone else? Okay, let's look at what Rav Goren said, because Rav Goren has a really interesting take on this. I'm sorry, not Rav Goren. Let's look at what Rav Chaim David Halevi said. Here we go, back to the Teshuva. First, he says that Rav Goren, first of all, we're talking about a situation, I'm not exactly sure the details, but it looks like they were trading 1,150 terrorists for a number of Israeli soldiers. I'm not sure how. And Rav Goren writes that it's asur. You know how to do it. Based on exactly what we just heard, Al Yesod, second line on the right at the end, Al Yesod HaMishnah HaMeforsemet Begittin, based on the famous Mishnah in Gittin, that's the Mishnah we learned, Ein Podin et HaShivuyim Yeter Al Kedei Demehen Mifnei Tikkun HaOlam. We're not allowed to redeem captives for more than they're worth because of Tikkun HaOlam, either because it's going to bankrupt the community or it's going to create a situation where more people are kidnapped. So Rav Goren uses the classic source that we studied to answer that it's not allowed to do that. And he even says that's even the case, even if we're afraid that the shavuyim, that the captors are in mortal danger. Remember, we pointed out that one of the exceptions to this rule might be that the captives are in mortal danger. However, Rav Goren says, even if they're in mortal danger, we are not allowed to ransom them for more than they're worth. And we'll read this paragraph here. Kemokein heitiv hagon harav Shlomo Goren lochiach shedat rov haposkim hi she'afilu nishkefet sakanat nefashot l'shavui ein liftot biyeter michtei demehan. Even if their life is in danger, you're not allowed to do it. The gamze hochiach mikama poskim uverosham Rabbeinu HaRambam she'acharei she'iflig b'mitzvah pidyon shavuyim. Even the Rambam says this after and saying after how important this mitzvah is. Ve'achad minimukav hu. One of the Rambam's explanations is shashavui harehu bichlal hareivim v'atzmeim ba'arumim. We consider a captive hungry, thirsty, naked, and in mortal danger. Even though he says that, siyem et divarav sheitaknu la'el she'ein podin et hatshuvuyin yet ha'michtei demeim. Nonetheless, the Rambam says we still don't rescue them for more than the value. V'atam b'chozeh mishum shemnachush v'sakat nafsho shel shivui zeh nachnis b'sakana rabim achirim. Right? Fascinating explanation. Why is it that Rav Goren says that even if that soldier who is in the hands of, let's say, Hamas, even if their life is in danger, we don't rescue them for more than they're worth? His answer is because that's going to put even more people's life in danger. So he's just weighing on a scale, which is like a terrible, I can imagine just the emotional, the horrific position to be in to make that decision. This person may die if we don't go get them, but 10 other people's life could be in danger if we do go get them. Like, how do you make that decision? But nonetheless, says Rav Goren, that's his psak. So I'll get to you 1 second, Carol. We have what is very common in this question. A posek, Rav Goren, saying the text that we have in our arsenal of Torah, the Mishnah in Masechet Gittin, that says, as great as a mitzvah as redeeming captives is, we don't do it if the price is too high, because it may cause more people to be taken captive, and it may even put more people's lives at risk. Rav Goren is satisfied that the sources that we have can guide us today. These ancient sources, thousands of years old, can guide us today. That's where we are right now. Take a break. Carol.
Well, the only thing I guess I'm a little troubled is, I'll ask a question first. Does Israel operate that way, saying that under that those learnings that we just did, that they wouldn't ransom for more than a captive is worth? So my question is, does Israel operate that way? Because I was under the impression that they don't, that they would do everything to get back everybody.
You are correct. This decision by Rav Goren was not requested by the Israeli army or government. It was just him opining on the question. And no, the Israeli army and government does not seek out halachic guidance on these things. And that's not the way they operate. We saw it last week. It was 3 for 1. We saw it with Gilad Shalit. It was over 1,000 to 1. So no, Israel does not operate according to Rabbi Goren's approach. Okay. Now comes along of Chaim David Halevi. I will share again. Rav Chaim David Halevi now says something amazing. He says on the bottom of the page here, okay, top of the page. Ta'amur, right on top here. Says Rav Chaim David Halevi. Up until now, we've been studying the words of Rav Goren. Now we're studying the words of Chaim David Halevi. He says everything that Rav Chaim David Halevi said is based on what we learned in the Mishnah in Gittin and the Rishonim, the medieval commentaries that came after them, and those were the ones that were talking about the exceptions that I mentioned without looking at the sources. Nonetheless, I believe, says Rav Chaim David Halevi, after asking forgiveness from Rav Goren, that, listen to this, she'ein mikol hanal ra'aya michra'at l'nidun didan. That nothing that Rav Goren said is a clear proof or does not provide clear direction for our situation. Right, so Rav Goren is basing himself on the Mishnah in Gittin and the later commentaries, and Rav Chaim David Halevi says that's true, he did that, but it still may be irrelevant. And he goes on to say in the second paragraph on the right column, Shekain b'chol hanal medubar b'kvutzot shel listim shodedim shekol mataratam hi l'schot ksafim rabim b'chol ha'efshar timurat pidyon shavuyim. When the Gemara talks about people being held captive, the circumstances are very different. The historical circumstances are very different than ours. What are they talking about? They're talking about some Jewish guy or gal walking down the street, and a bunch of bandits take them and tell their family, if you don't pay us an exorbitant amount of money, we're not going to give you your brother back. They have one goal. What's their goal?
Money.
To make money. There's no ideological battle going on. There's no political battle. There's no religious battle. It's just money. And so the way to deal with it is, well, don't give in to the first demand, because if you don't give in to the first demand, then they're not going to bother to take someone else. What's the point? They're not going to get their money. They'll move on to a different business model. Right? So that's what Rav Chaim David Halevi says. What's going on in that case is a business situation. It's just about money. Oh, mechiratam la'avadim, or they're going to sell these people as slaves. But again, the reason they're kidnapping people is for money. Giving in is only going to make them hungrier, and therefore more people will be taken. But that's not the situation that Israel's dealing with, right? The Hamas is not taking these people for money. This is an ideological thing. And Rav Chaim David Halevi goes on to say in the next paragraph, the ilu, right in this second full paragraph on the left side, the ilu anu nitunim b'matzav milchama kashem emushach in klal ha'am ha'Palestini. We, on the other hand, are in a long, ongoing war with Palestinians. Shemitocho yetzu kavutzot halochamot b'achzariot b'ama Yehudi ba'artzo. I mean, this is very relevant. And from them, they send soldiers into the land, our land. Varekahu medini lumi. And the background here is not financial. The background here is political. As long as there's no political solution, this war is going to get more serious. Kvutzot terror ela osot kechol asher la'el yadan lifgoa kashot b'ama Yehudi b'chol midat efsherutehem. These people are going to try in any way possible to seriously hurt the Jewish people in any way, in any shape or form that they can. Ve'en safek shelo yachlu limsor nafsham litfos shivuyim Yehudim hayu osim zot midei yom v'yomo. Ve'en safek shelo yachlu limsor nafsham litfos shivuyim Yehudim hayu osim zot midei yom yom kedei l'shchur et shivuyim Yisrael shebidei Yisrael. They're going to keep doing this no matter what, whether you pay or don't pay, in order to get their people back. And even to get other types of concessions from Israel. V'darcheitenu shel tzahal l'shmor al darchei yabasha v'ayam ulhagim b'kaf al ezrachei Yisrael. Ani ataiti zu nekuda chashuva ma'od b'diyunenu al pidyon shivuyenu hachayalim. We have to take this into consideration, right? Whether or not we give back soldiers, these terror groups are still going to do it to inflict pain. Whether or not we give back, prisoners, these terror groups are going to continue to do this in order to inflict pain on the Jewish people, even as they're also doing it to try to get some of their prisoners back. So Rav Chaim Halevi is saying that the sources from Masechet Gittin and all the Rishonim that talk about the damage that can be done to society if we give in to their demands don't really apply here, because it's a totally different situation. One is a situation where they are just trying to make money, and this is a situation where it's part of a war strategy. So the whole question of giving more or fewer is not really relevant. And so let me stop here and see if there are any comments on that, and then we'll look at one more really interesting tidbit from Rabbi Chaim David Halevi. Rabbi.
So, Rabbi, where does, in the mix of all of what you've just summarized, where does Rabbi Chaim David Halevi come down? Does he say it's okay to give exorbitant amounts of money and collateral to redeem captives?
So let's look. We'll get there 1 second.
Okay.
Any other comments or questions before we move on? Okay. So let's go back to the source now. What he says here on the bottom is really amazing. He says, Nakdim on the bottom, sheyesh ba'ayot kashot, that there are some difficult questions, shenotrot b'chayenu, that we have in our life, she'ein lahem pitaron barur v'chotech b'halacha. This is really amazing. That do not have a clear precedent in existing halacha. It's very rare to hear that from a posting. That's what he's saying here, right? We can't take the sources from Gittin that we're talking about assorted bandits on the side of the road, or even, a king or some sort of royal official taking someone and putting them in their dungeon. We can't compare that to a war, an ongoing war. And that's an example, says Rav Chaim Halevi, of a situation where there's just no precedent in halacha for this. Where do we find any discussion of our contemporary situation in the sources that we saw? Here we need a new halachic approach. This is a nuance. We have value. We have Jewish values that we can apply, and halachic values that we can apply, but it's not a one-to-one anymore, as Rav Goren tried to suggest. Zehaya kocham shel rabbonotenu shebechol mikra chadash shebali adam. Sorry. For every new situation that came to their hands. Oh, here it is. Sorry, I got to turn this one around. Why can't I turn this one around? Sorry. I'm having trouble turning this source around. All right, I'm going to have to read it because I can't turn it around. I'll read it from my copy of the book. I apologize for this technical snafu. He says, Rav Goren, that for every new situation that came around, lo histakfu ba'utan halachot shayu misarot bi'adam ad az, the rabbis were never satisfied with what they had already in their hands. El tarchu lechadesh halachot chadashot. They worked hard to develop new halachot. The dugma birura lekach hem divrei hatosot besugya hanal. And a good example of this is what the Tosfot said in our situation. What did Tosfot say in our situation? That after the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, Jewish blood was cheap, and people were taking Jewish hostages regardless of how much they were getting. So the whole question of tikkun olam and not paying the high ransom in an attempt to stop hostage taking was not relevant anymore, because they were going to take hostages, they were going to take people ransom or captive, I should say, anyway. And so to answer your question, Rabbi Gerson, let me see if this source is right side up. Rav Chaim David Halevi goes on to say, yeah, right here, second paragraph on the page. Uvenidun didan. Back to our situation. Kvar katavnu beruach divrei Tosfot. We've already written along the lines of Tosfot in their second answer. Shekatvu shebeshat churban habayit lo shayach de lo ligribu. And in the time of the second Beit HaMikdash, of the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, the concern that paying too high a ransom was going to encourage more hostage taking was no longer relevant. In the war that we are fighting, it also doesn't make sense to take into account whether or not more soldiers or even civilians are going to be taken hostage. She'ein heim yicholim litfos shivuyim b'Yisrael. The shivuyim eila shenaflu li'adam hayu b'matzav milchama b'Lebanon. This is really interesting, and this has also changed. He's suggesting that the enemy can't just come into Israel and take hostages. The only hostages they take are ones who are fighting in war in Lebanon. Under circumstances that we don't quite understand. In a war, the enemy is going to take as many combat soldiers, as many soldiers as possible, regardless of what they think they're going to get back. Therefore, the concern of paying too high a price is also not relevant. Therefore, we should not learn it's prohibited from the Mishnah. So what's really fascinating here is I wonder what Reb Chaim David Halevi would say today, right? Because Hamas did come in to Israel and take civilians, right? So we've sort of come full circle. On the one hand, Rav Goren says we have to follow the Mishnah. The Mishnah says we can't ransom them for more than they're worth because it's going to cause us more people to be taken. Rav Chaim David Halevi says, wait a second, these people are being taken on the battlefield, not off the side of the road. The enemy's going to take them no matter what. That's what you do in a war. These people weren't civilians. So we can't apply the Mishnah. But now we're in a situation where, for the first time, I think, there are civilians, hundreds of civilians who were taken. So maybe he would even admit that Rav Goren is right now. Because these are civilians. These aren't soldiers. Or on the other hand, it was a war. So they took who they can get. It doesn't matter. So it's to me, it's still like unclear what Rav Chaim David Halevi would say here. What's interesting for me, and I hope for you, is that we have this contemporary machloket between two great rabbinic leaders. Rabbi Goren, who says the ancient sources can apply to the situation still, and Rav Chaim David Halevi saying not always. There are some times where no matter how many sources we marshal, our full library, right? Sources we marshal, it's new. It's a new reality. And we have to use Jewish values and maybe some other halachic values, but it's not a one-to-one anymore. That to me is a fascinating thing for a posek to say. It's not something you hear them say often. But again, Rav Chaim David Halevi's proof is Tosfot. Because in our situation, when the Mishnah says you're not allowed to redeem captives for more than they're worth, comes along Tosfot and says, except when you can. And when can you? When the rules have changed. When the rules of society have changed so much that the Mishnah is no longer talking to the same situation. And once Rav Chaim David Halevi sees the Tosfot doing it, he feels now he has license to also say that we have to do it. We have to also sort of be bold enough to come up with a new approach to a situation which has not really existed before. So, did we answer the question of how Israel should deal with this? That is something which is so heart-wrenching and difficult, and there's so many factors, again, that are so different. The whole nation's morale is at stake. That's another factor we have to think of, right? The whole army's morale, the nation's morale. So many, that's a factor too, which is not considered in the sources. And so we don't have to answer the question. We shouldn't even dare to try to answer the question, and we should never be in a position to have to answer the question. But we see that there are sources all the way back from the time of the Tanakh, Sefer Bereshit, that deal with this question. And some of them are relevant to contemporary situations, and some of them may not be relevant to contemporary situations. And as in any question of halacha, we have to see if what we have at hand is relevant, and if not, we have to use those values to try to come up with an answer when necessary. So I'll stop now and see if anyone has any comments or questions before we say goodnight. Nothing? Yes, Rabbi.
It's pretty fascinating how each posek contextualizes the Mishnah, and then utilizes that for the respective bottom lines. And I would dare say that if the Israeli government is going by either one of them, it's probably more aligned with Reb Chaim David Halevi, working on that changing circumstances criterion, which I think is, you also have to consider public pressure. And the fact that there's so many hostages and so many families who are campaigning to the government. I'll just throw out another situation that may or may not inform this situation, and that was the raid on Entebbe, right in 1976, which was a pretty bold operation, and in many ways vindicated the military decision. In that case, it wasn't a swap, it was a rescue. But it kind of cast the iron, so to speak, of kind of a new chapter in Israeli history as to what Israel would be willing to do to be able to rescue hostages.
Sure. I mean, that's a really interesting question. Another way to look at Yeter al Kadei Demehen, like how many other lives do you put at risk to launch a military operation? Right. This reminded me of what you just said. Also brought up the situation now. The name of the soldier that was held captive is escaping me, but he was held captive in the West Bank, and they found him, and a military operation was launched, and in the process, he was killed, and the commander of the operation was killed. Waxman, right? I think Waxman.
Nachshon Waxman.
Thank you. Yeah. So that's a really interesting, another way to look at it. Like, we're not talking about giving people or paying for people. We're talking about risking the lives of other people. That's a cost-benefit analysis, I guess, to put it in the coldest terms possible. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Okay, my friends, thank you for coming. Thank you for joining. We'll keep you posted as to the next series of classes, which will hopefully now be back to Wednesday nights. And thank you for joining. And have a wonderful evening. And I hope to see you all soon.
Thank you.
Thank
you.
Thank you.
you.
For coming.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
everybody.